This week on The Inside Story, World Refugee Day, the United Nations tries to focus attention on tens of millions of refugees. From Afghanistan to Ukraine, Sudan to Syria, we share the stories of those who fled their home countries and examine the conditions that turned citizens into refugees. Now, The Inside Story, World Refugee Day.
Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Elizabeth Lee in Washington. 146 countries around the world in 1951 agreed to abide by a United Nations treaty called the Convention Relating to the Status of Refugees. The world marks the passage of that treaty on June 20th every year on World Refugee Day. The treaty was originally intended to help Europeans driven from their homes during World War II, but over time, the UN treaty has expanded to include anyone forced from their homes by conflict or political persecution. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, currently, the number of people around the world forcibly displaced by their homes is at an all-time high of 108 million. We'll tell some of their stories today on The Inside Story. After more than a year fighting, the damage caused by Russia's invasion still haunts a vast majority of the Ukrainian population. While some opted to stay, the Ukraine government says around 18% of the population fled their homeland. Thousands sought refuge in neighboring Poland. As part of our World Refugee coverage, VOA traveled to the outskirts of Warsaw to visit a center that serves as a temporary home for thousands of displaced Ukrainians. VOA's Licia Bakalets has more.
This building on the edge of Warsaw once served as a global expo exhibit hall. Since March 2022, it has become a refugee center for Ukrainians. 60-year-old Tayana Lada has lived here for about a year. Kuzya the cat and a collection of silver rings, the main treasures Lada has brought from her hometown, Zaporizhia. She decided to flee after Russian forces shelled her neighborhood.
A rocket landed next to the house. It was almost 5 a.m. And in principle, it is not scary to die. It's scary when you get mutilated.
The refugee center where Tayana lives is private. It is financed by Polish and Ukrainian business people and non-profit organizations. Here she has as many as 1,000 neighbors, the majority women and children, all live in this huge hall. At the beginning, cots lay near each other. Several months ago, short plywood dividers were built. This is the only privacy refugees can count on. Doors and walls are prohibited for fire safety.
This is our home now, maybe, for a long time.
There are washing machines and showers. Each aisle has charging stations. The dining hall is in the next room. Olena Kondratyuk from Vinnytsia is in charge here.
3 of my kitchen team members are from Crimea. They fled through Russia. 4 of them are from Donetsk, and 2 are from Zaporizhia. There is nowhere for them to return until the war ends. At the time I arrived, we had 2 halls wholly filled. It was like this, a bed next to a bed. There were about 2,000 people. Children were screaming, and dogs and cats.
For children, there is a makeshift school.
In the elementary school, we have 23 students from 1st to 4th grade. We work according to the program of the Ukrainian school. We comply with all norms and all types of work, as we learned in Ukraine.
Zakharchenko is a teacher and lives in the center as well. She and her daughter fled from Novakakhovka. She says she finds consolation in teaching here.
For me, this is an opportunity to get out of bed because I fell into depression. I had a feeling that life is over for me.
Many of the center's residents share those feelings. Volunteers try to help them to find a job or better accommodation if they can afford it. But most cannot. Some are dreaming of returning home, while others have come to accept that this may never happen. Lesia Bakales for VOA News, Warsaw.
Turkey is known for its cultural diversity. It also hosts more refugees than any other country in the world. They include more than 3 million Syrians escaping the civil war. Newly elected Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is standing by his policy of admitting millions of refugees, mainly Syrians, into Turkey and allowing them to stay despite growing public opposition. Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul.
Many Syrian refugees who fled Turkey lost more than their homes and their country. 18-year-old Semir, who only wanted to be identified by his first name, lost his parents and 4 siblings in the civil war. He lost his legs, but says he hopes to walk again.
They helped me a lot with everything. Praise be to God.
The Istanbul Orthotic Prosthetic Center was set up by Turkey's Humanitarian Relief Foundation, as well as the International Doctors Association. It uses state-of-the-art technology under the supervision of Dr. Yashar Tatar.
Especially in Syria, there are a high number of amputees involving multiple limb loss. Burns caused by barrel bombs also posed major challenges for us. We have served around 2,045 amputees, and we have made approximately 4,000 prosthetic limbs. This is a huge number. Few centers in the world can make so many prostheses in such a short time.
February's deadly earthquakes in Turkey and Syria added to the centre's work, as many people lost limbs in the disaster. Turkey hosts over 3 million Syrian refugees, along with large numbers of Iraqis and Afghans. Anti-refugee sentiment is growing, often reflected in graffiti.
Societal problems can arise from the arrival of a large number of refugees. Turkey's recent economic problems have added to this. On top of this, the election saw some politicians in particular bring up the issue of refugees.
During May's presidential elections, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's challengers vowed to return millions of Syrian refugees. Analysts say Erdogan's victory comes as a relief not only to refugees, but also to the European Union, which pays Turkey to host refugees. But Erdogan, possibly mindful of Turkish public unease over refugees, is now vowing to step up the building of homes in Syrian areas outside Damascus's control to facilitate the return of 1 million Syrians. How many will take that offer remains to be seen.
Along the U.S.-Mexico border, the distinction between who is a migrant and who is a refugee can be murky. Many migrants seek asylum. When they do, they become political refugees, a distinction that can affect their fate. Not murky is a grim U.S. Border Patrol statistic. More than 8,000 migrant deaths have been recorded along the border since 1988. VOA immigration reporter Alini Barrows visited the county where the highest number of migrants who died ended their journey.
A lot of attention has been focused on migrants crossing between ports of entry at the U.S.-Mexico border. But Brooks County, about 130 kilometers north of the Rio Grande, faces a separate migrant crisis. From 2012 to 2019, it had more migrant deaths than any other South Texas county, earning the name the Killing Fields, according to a 2020 report by the University of Texas Strauss Center. Migrants who cross undetected into the United States often use Brooks County as a corridor to their next destination. To avoid the Border Patrol checkpoint near Falfurrias, the biggest town in Brooks County, they walk for days across remote private ranches. Some die from heat exhaustion, dehydration, or hypothermia.
Last year we found a total of about 5 bodies or remains. Some were recent, some had been there for a while.
The ground is sandy. Temperature often rises to 38 degrees Celsius and above. Landmarks are few, and it's easy for migrants to get lost or walk in circles. Cervantes says those found alive receive help and are turned over to Border Patrol authorities.
We have found last year the same thing. We found probably half a dozen people just wandering around that were really, really close to death already.
Those who are lost or left behind can sometimes call for help.
Every single scenario is different depending on the call.
Sheriff Benny Martinez says more migrants die in Brooks County than anywhere along the border. When migrants call 911 for help, dispatch stays on the call with them for as long as possible. Sheriff's office staff also work with U.S. Border Patrol officers to rescue migrants in distress or to remove migrants' remains.
In the hot days, which we usually have, within 72 hours, they're pretty much be gone already. Now, Border Patrol's real good. They have EMT people. They go out there and they apply the IVs quickly and they start the rescue, right, with the beacons.
Unclaimed bodies are sent to Texas State University. In 2022, U.S. border officials found the remains of 858 migrants along the southern U.S. border. In 2021, that number was 657. In 2020, 255. But migrant advocates say those numbers are too low. Eduardo Canales, director of the South Texas Human Rights Center in Falfurrias, a nonprofit that runs a missing person recovery program, says over 200 bodies were discovered in the past 2 years in Brooks County alone. He says finding missing people is difficult.
Every year, June 20 is dedicated to raising awareness of the situation of refugees throughout the world. World Refugee Day was first celebrated in 2001 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees that defined who a refugee is and set out the rights of individuals who are granted asylum and the responsibilities of nations that grant asylum. What is the difference between these terms and why are the distinctions important? Here's a quick rundown. Refugee. A refugee is someone who is forced to flee their home country due to fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership in particular social group or political opinion, according to the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention. UNHCR says 117.2 million people will be forcibly displaced or stateless in 2023. Asylum seeker. Asylum seekers are essentially refugees, but their claim to refugee status hasn't been evaluated and they have not yet received any legal recognition or status. There were around 5.6 million people around the world waiting for a decision on their asylum claims as of June 2023, UNHCR said. Internally displaced people. An internally displaced person or IDP is a person who fled their home but has not crossed an international border to find sanctuary. Even if they fled for reasons similar to those affecting refugees, armed conflict, generalized violence, human rights violations, IDPs legally remain under the protection of their own government, even though that government might be the cause of their flight. There are 61.2 million internally displaced people globally as of June 2023, UNHCR said. Migrant. Migrant is an umbrella term for a person who moves away from their place of usual residence for any variety of reasons, but not necessarily because of a direct threat of persecution or death. They may be moving temporarily or permanently, legally or illegally. Though the terms refugee, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and migrants may seem similar, those groups are protected in different ways. For example, the International Convention in 1951 outlined certain rights for people deemed refugees, whereas migrants have no such rights. Refugees are protected from being deported or returned to situations that might threaten their lives. They should be given access to social services and integrated into their new country's society. Migrants, on the other hand, are subject to a country's immigration laws and procedures and can be turned away or deported back to their homeland.
The cruelty of war continues to plague Ethiopia's Tigrayan population. After escaping to Sudan to avoid a civil war, the outbreak of violence there has them now searching for safety elsewhere. Caught between two wars, many are resorting to desperate measures to find freedom. VOA's Henry Wilkins has this report from Chad.
Since Ethiopia's civil war started in 2020, neighbouring Sudan has received 70,000 Ethiopian refugees. Now, many find themselves caught up in the maelstrom of Sudan's civil war, which started on April 15th. An Ethiopian refugee in a camp near the Sudanese city of Gadaref, who asked to remain anonymous out of fear for his family's safety, told VOA by phone,
Since there is no medicine and there is shortage of water and food. Also, there is a high market price, and there is no way also where the refugees can get money, even from family abroad, since the banks are not working.
He says this situation has persisted since Sudan's war started. Although Ethiopia's war has broadly come to an end thanks to a peace process started in November, Ethiopia's Tigray region is still far too dangerous for most refugees to return. On June 1st, Human Rights Watch said a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans is ongoing despite the peace agreement. A report by the British newspaper The Guardian on May 15th said Ethiopian refugees in Sudan are falling into the hands of human traffickers who promise passage to Europe. Some are even being kidnapped by them. Also speaking before Sudan's civil war broke out, another Tigray refugee whose name we have changed to protect his safety. He is from the Ethiopian town of Humera. VOA visited Humera last year and heard testimonies of vicious bouts of ethnic cleansing. He says he tried paying traffickers to take him to Europe through Libya rather than stay in Sudan.
We spent about 2 weeks in a huge building like a warehouse. They used to give us water and 2 pieces of bread a day. There were no houses there. That's why we didn't leave the building.
As fighting in Khartoum continues, some flow of aid into sites in Sudan occupied by Ethiopian refugees has resumed, after initially being halted entirely by the conflict.
The people of Afghanistan have known war for decades, and thousands have fled either the fighting or the Taliban, who regained power in 2021. One of the places where Afghans have found a new home is Serbia. Dozens of refugees enter that Eastern European country every day, following a dangerous path west. VOA's Wali Arian spent time with refugees in Belgrade and filed this report, narrated by Bejan Hamdard.
Dozens of Afghan refugees enter Serbia daily, hoping to be registered and reach Western European countries. Shaukatullah, who only provided his first name, says before reaching Serbia, he was deported repeatedly back to Turkey from Bulgaria.
We were deported 4 times. Bulgaria arrested us. They made their dogs bite us. They beat us. Other than that, they take whatever you have. We faced many difficulties reaching Serbia. Now we are in Serbia, in a camp.
The refugees here have taken treacherous routes to Europe, traveling through Iran, Turkey, and Bulgaria to reach Serbia. For decades, Serbia served as an avenue for migrants to reach Western Europe. However, it is now more challenging for refugees to go from Serbia to their preferred destinations. According to a UN Refugee Agency report, Afghans made up 36% of the nearly 130,000 refugee arrivals in Serbia in 2022. Syrian refugees were in second place with 29%.
Almost 900,000 Palestinians living in the West Bank are classified as refugees, meaning they were displaced from their homes by Israel since it became a nation in 1948. About a quarter of them live in refugee camps, which are crowded and poor and have frequently been the scene of clashes with Israeli soldiers. Linda Gradstein has more from Balata refugee camp in northern West Bank.
In one of the Balata refugee camp's cramped alleys, Riyad Abu Shalal, the mother of Palestinian militant leader Abdullah Abu Shalal, stands in the rubble of her house.
The first time the Israeli soldiers came to arrest him, they fired through the windows and the door, but he escaped. The second time they destroyed the house, but he also escaped. But because they destroyed the house, now the whole family of 9 has no place to go.
As Abu Shalal's mother recounts the Israeli raid from 2 weeks ago, young men start running through the alleys as news spreads that Israeli undercover troops have entered the camp again. Balata is the West Bank's largest refugee camp. 30,000 Palestinians live in an area of just 1/4 of a square kilometer. Like all refugee camps in the West Bank, it is run by the UN, which is struggling after a drop in donations. A 4-month strike that cut all services to the camp, including schools and health clinics, just recently ended. Almost 2/3 of the Palestinians living in Balata are under the age of 25. They say they want an independent Palestinian state but don't see much chance of it. So they have turned to guns and say they will force Israel and the Palestinian Authority to give them their rights. Linda Gradstein for VOA News, Balata Refugee Camp.
Lack of funding is hampering the UN Refugee Agency and its ability to support thousands of displaced people living in Kenya's urban environments. This financial shortfall hasn't hindered progress, but has become the catalyst to spark a refugee-led organization in building education, protection, and business skills. From Nairobi, VOA's Mohammed Youssef has more on the Youth Voices community.
Funding shortages have caused UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, to reduce the assistance it offers to more than 570,000 refugees living in Kenyan camps and urban areas in recent years. The agency says as of June 15th, it has received only 31% of the $153 million required funding to adequately meet the needs of these refugees. In response, urban refugees in Nairobi are learning new skills to survive and start their own businesses. They receive training in online product selling at the Youth Voices Community Center, a refugee-founded and led organization that empowers urban refugees. Founded in 2016 and in collaboration with other independent groups, at least 120 refugees have benefited from the business training in the past 12 months.
As a refugee, my life can change anytime. If I start my business, it can change my life. I can't continue to live like this.
The theme for this year's World Refugee Day is Hope Away from Home, and this hope is being encouraged here in Kenya.
As we report on refugees around the world, here is a story of overcoming obstacles. A Somali woman has announced her candidacy for mayor of St. Louis Park, a city in the U.S. state of Minnesota. If elected, she would become the first Muslim and Somali mayor in the state. Mohammed Makade has this story from Minneapolis, narrated by Salim Solomon.
I'm running for mayor of St. Louis Park.
Nadia Mohammed, an at-large member of the St. Louis Park, Minnesota City Council, is vying to become the first Somali mayor in the state's history. Mohammed, 26, came to St. Louis Park, a western suburb of Minneapolis, as a 10-year-old refugee. In 2019, she made history by becoming the city's first Muslim and first Somali council member. She was also the youngest ever elected.
I love the city. I love St. Louis Park. I've grown to love every part of it.
Minnesota is home to the largest Somali community in the United States, and Mohammed says becoming a mayor is a way to show anything is possible.
I think it means that anybody can be anything, honestly. I think visual representation absolutely matters, right? But we're not here just to represent, we're here so that we can do good work.
Before we say goodbye, here's a look at one man's story that led to the VOA documentary From Fear to Freedom, A Uyghur's Journey, which will air in next week's show.
Sometimes, like mentally. Sometimes you just lie in your bed, but you can't just get up. You ask yourself, what is this? Oh, that's fear. I've seen dozens of friends, personal mentors, teachers, and some relatives being targeted. They had been interned, imprisoned, killed.
事实上，新疆教培中心就是一所学校，所有的学员是免费吃住，人格尊严不受侵犯。
I work as a journalist at Voice of America. My beat at VOA is news about Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in China. Every time I cover news, do interviews, and read reports about the repression against the Uyghurs, to me it's always reliving the trauma that I have lived.
I'm Elizabeth Lee. Stay up to date with all the news at voanews.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News. Follow me on Twitter at EliTV1. Catch up on past episodes at our free streaming service, VOA Plus. For all of those behind the scenes who brought you today's show, we'll see you next week on The Inside Story.